Lucius Julius Caesar, Consul 90 BCE, Censor 89 BCE. A scion of gens Julia, and the most accomplished Caesar of his generation, Lucius Julius Caesar and his brother courted controversy, unlike their more cautious cousins. Elected consul the year after his cousin Sextus, Lucius was forced to lay aside whatever plans he may have had in order to meet the challenge of the social war, fought against Rome's discontented and long-suffering Italian allies. As one of the three army commanders in 90, Lucius battled the Samnites. While he did win a single battle, he got the worst of the campaign overall. Yet, such was his influence that he still managed to receive a triumph for his decidedly mediocre performance. In Rome, Lucius passed a bill to enfranchise Italians who had remained loyal, thus beginning a sequence of events leading to a political solution where a military triumph was no longer feasible. Elected censor the next year, Lucius Caesar began the work of registering new citizens, but his original vision was altered by another bill about how to register the Italians in the tribes, and the war's continuation meant that his labor became more complicated. Once the war was won, Lucius and his brother had a nasty falling out with Gaius Marius, and this may have meant tension with their surviving cousin, Gaius Julius Caesar, the brother-in-law of Marius. Lucius publicly endorsed Sulla's decision to march on Rome in 88 in order to reverse Sulpicius Rufus's bill to transfer the Mithridatic command to the elderly Marius. When Sulla departed for the east, Cinna and Marius did their own march on Rome and murdered 6 senators, with Lucius, his brother, and some close allies being among this chosen few. I will consider the impact Lucius's career had on that of his son and namesake, as well as the younger cousin Gaius Julius Caesar, who went on to become quite famous, and that's not even to mention Lucius's grandson Mark Antony, who also went on to have a bit of notoriety. Whereas your average patrician family could merely trace their origins back to the foundation of the Republic, or perhaps to a specific king who empowered one of their ancestors, gens Julia rose above such concerns because it owed its origin directly to the goddess Venus. Venus, of course, was the mother of Aeneas, the Trojan prince, who had come west. His son Ascanius had then founded Alba Longa, and their descendants had then moved to Rome when Rome was founded. And so, gens Julia was not only original to Rome, but could trace its ancestry back to before human history. So they felt like among the patricians, they were still patrician in relative terms. That being said, the gens as a whole had not had that much success since the early Republic. It had faded into obscurity until 208. After Cannae, a number of senators died, and there were openings in the senior ranks for the first time in a long time that allowed Sextus Julius Caesar to become praetor in 208. A couple generations later, another Sextus Julius Caesar did something that no previous Caesar had ever done, and became consul. He did this in 157, and most likely he is the common ancestor of the two Caesar branches. So in the time of our Lucius Caesar, he has a brother, and then they have 2 cousins, Sextus and Gaius. Each of them, we believe, are descendants of this Sextus Julius Caesar. So, in all likelihood, Lucius, Caesar Strabo, and their sister, named Julia, just like every woman in the family, were almost certainly grandchildren of the man who was consul back in 157. His father would have been named Lucius, whereas the father of his cousins was named Gaius, and neither of them attained the consulship. We actually don't know for certain if they made it anywhere politically. Most likely, one or both of them might have made it to the praetorship. But because of the way the Julian narrative has been constructed, we're supposed to believe that Caesar emerged almost out of obscurity single-handedly after centuries of obscurity. But the reality is more complicated, and the family as a whole was making a comeback. Lucius will be a big part of that, in fact, as we'll see. Lucius Julius Caesar was fortunate. While a number of people running for office had a lonely road and were alone, he had a number of built-in allies. He was part of what I like to call the Julian cohort. He had a cousin who was a year older, Sextus. Lucius himself was born in 132. His cousin Gaius was born a couple years later, perhaps around 130. And then his younger brother, Caesar Strabo, was born around 127 or 126. So all four of these boys would come of age at about the same time. They would all be in their prime at the same time, and they would be able to help each other. And so this was a huge advantage. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, so far as we know, they all four were always pretty close-knit, with one possible exception. Now, the family would expand through the services of their sisters and cousins. So cousin Julia, the sister of Sextus and Gaius, would go on to marry none other than Gaius Marius. At the time, Marius had held the praetorship, but had not gotten a consulship. Because of his new man status, it was unlikely that he ever would, but he was still a prominent general. And perhaps the idea of the marriage was simply that if he were married to a patrician, that his ambitions would seem more real. Well, at any rate, he will manage to become consul, not once, not twice, not thrice, not 4 times, not 5 times, but 6 times. And then one more much later that we'll get to. And with him becoming the biggest name in Roman politics, this meant a whole host of opportunities for the 4 Julians. Now, the other close ally they had, who is a little bit easy to forget about, is half-brother to Lucius and Caesar Strabo, and that is Quintus Lutatius Catulus, the eldest son of their mother Populia. He became consul in 102. And what's useful about him is that he is far more conservative than they are. So he is from the opposite faction in Rome. Yet, so far as we know, he personally was an ally to them. So they have at least one person they can count on to back them up, who is ostensibly not going to be all that friendly on voting matters, but might still back them for election. So, they are very well set up for success, and perhaps they even helped to grease the wheels and make sure that Catulus cooperated with Marius in 102 during the Aquae Sextii campaign. So perhaps Lucius or one of the other Julians played the role of ambassador to make sure that Catulus deferred to Marius and Marius's military judgment. At any rate, though, they were now very set, and it was quite likely that all 4 of them would go on to be consul, all things being equal. As we'll see, not all things were equal, and only 2 of them ever made the consulship. Lucius Julius Caesar was not his much more famous younger cousin, and so we don't know all the details of his rise through the cursus honorum. However, we do know a couple of details as he starts to near the pinnacle of his career. In 94, he was elected praetor, and after that, for at least 1 year, possibly 2, he served as the pro-praetorian governor of Macedonia. This province could be given out to either praetors or consuls, and it was one of the more desirable assignments in the Republic. Asia is probably a little better because the money there is amazing, but Macedonia has plenty of money, it has plenty of culture, and also there is still some problem that they have on occasion with the Thracians, which means some opportunity for military experience and to even win a triumph. We don't know any details of this governorship, but we can rest assured, I think, that Lucius made some money and, at a bare minimum, came home with a full wallet to try to run for consul, which he clearly did intend to do in the year 90. So he was very well set up, and he also almost certainly was out canvassing on behalf of his cousin Sextus, who sought and won the office in 91. When we look back in retrospect, it's clear that many Roman elites believed that if you just ignored a problem, it would go away. Perhaps they ignored a number of problems that did go away, and that's why they thought this was viable. But in the case of the Italian demand for citizenship, that problem proved to be more lasting and didn't go away, Rather, it blew up into a full-scale revolt. There were plenty of signs in retrospect, such as the Italians making veiled threats to Marcus Livius Drusus about what the consequences would be if he didn't come through for them, or when they tried to assassinate Sextus Julius Caesar and Lucius Marcius Philippus, the two consuls in 91. But the Romans still felt that this problem could be dealt with minimally, and so what they decided to do was simply ban Latins and Italians from the city. Problem solved. Except then they just organized in the countryside and revolted. By the time that all of that happened, Lucius had already been elected as the patrician consul for 90. Remember, consular elections are held the summer before, so you know who the consuls will be usually 6 months before they actually take office. And his colleague was Publius Rutilius Lupus, a nephew of Gaius Marius, and therefore someone who was tied into the network of the family of Sextus and Gaius Caesar. So, an ally, almost built in. Even if now we're stretching a little bit, but still, most likely because Lucius and Lupus would be pretty close in age, they already knew each other anyway, and they have this connection. So they were most likely looking forward to a relatively peaceful consulship. Who knows what plans they might have had? If Lucius were thinking like a normal Roman senator, and we have no reason to think that he wasn't, he would be eyeing a prominent command as a proconsul and then hoping to win some military glory that way. But whatever those expectations he had might have been, they became completely irrelevant when the Italian revolt blew up after Livius Drusus was stabbed in the Forum, and then, after that, he was embroiled in the social war, and that would define the rest of his career and indeed life, as it would for so many other Romans of all ranks. One idea that Arthur Kahn had in his book, The Education of Julius Caesar, is that Lucius Julius Caesar must have been a supporter of Drusus. And the reason I say that this idea is dubious is because the only reason why he thinks that is because Lucius eventually proposed granting citizenship to those who hadn't revolted to deal with the revolt. But this is only after a year of hard campaigning where he had seen firsthand that the Italians would not be easily beaten. So perhaps he was actually on the other side of it, but then saw the error of his ways. Or maybe he wasn't involved in this controversy very much at all. The fact is, though, most Romans, both elite and common, at the time, were against granting Italian citizenship. For the senators, they didn't want someone to become the patron of all the Italians. For the common Romans, they thought this would dilute their political rights, and also their access to land when there were land commissions handing out land. Because a lot of the time, the land would actually be taken from Italians and given to Romans. So all Romans of all classes agreed that citizenship should be tightened, not extended. But ultimately, Lucius would come around on that issue. But again, contrary to Mr. Kahn, Professor Kahn, I'm sure he's long dead now, but contrary to Professor Kahn, I seriously doubt that Lucius was out advocating a deeply unpopular position the year when he ran for and was elected consul, given that this was anathema to pretty much every voter in Rome. The social war technically began in late 91, but by the time that the Romans had raised forces, it was already 90, and Lucius had taken office along with Lupus. The Romans eventually determined that they would need 3 large armies to go out and crush the revolt. To that end, they'd need to find a third commander. They looked at the 2 consuls from the last year, and they determined that only Sextus Julius Caesar made sense because Philippus had been far too controversial and had been far too at odds with Livius Drusus, to the point that a number of people thought that he might have actually ordered him killed. And so, this meant that in the social war, 2 of the 3 armies would be under the command of men named Julius Caesar, and the third would be under a family ally, or at least a family ally would be the second in command at worst. So, Lucius himself would command against the Samnites in the south. His colleague as senior legate would be Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who was by this time an experienced and talented commander. He had proven himself under Marius in both North Africa against the Numidians, and also in North Italy and or southern France against the Cimbri, Teutones, and other tribes of the area. So Sulla would prove to be an excellent legate and eventually take command later. As for his colleague Lupus, he would be tasked with fighting the Marsi, the largest of the rebel groups, and he would have his uncle Gaius Marius as senior legate. As we all know already, Lupus gets killed, Marius takes charge before the year's out. The other front, we'll see Sextus Julius Caesar march out as proconsul over the Apennines and into the territory of Asculum. He will end up dying dying after action of a disease, and then his command will go to his senior legate, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, father of the famous Pompey the Great. Now, the plan was that if the Romans could win these battles early, they could prevent the revolt from spreading and show the allies that resistance was not viable and they must submit to the majesty of Rome. Unfortunately for them, they would find out quickly that trying to impose their will on people who knew every little detail about how they fought and had adopted every single one of them would mean that they're fighting on a one-to-one basis and that an outright military victory was nigh impossible. So let's go and look at Lucius's track record as a commander fighting the Samnites, one of the ancient enemies of Rome. Lucius Caesar arrived in Samnite country only to find that his options were rather limited by what the Samnites were up to. Two communities had chosen to remain loyal to Rome, Isernia and Acerrae, and his task, therefore, was to relieve those two communities. Due to the sudden blow-up of the social war, neither of the cities had been able to stock up food, and neither could last forever. So he needed to break through and make sure that those cities were saved. At first, his plan was to try to achieve surprise with a fairly small force, so he sent two of his legions under one of his legates, and tried to relieve the siege of Isernia that way, but that sally failed, as 2,000 of the 12,000 men dispatched were killed. That's a nasty little defeat, but it's hardly fatal when he had a total of 5 legions and 30,000 men. So he decided instead, rather than dividing his force, to keep his army together and try to win one battle at a time. So it's probably a wise adjustment. He will now be marching on one of the two cities, it's not entirely clear which one, and he won't make it there because he'll be intercepted by the main Samnite army under their consul, because yes, by this point they have adopted a lot of Rome's ideas. Their consul will be named Mutilus. And Mutilus will do something that is extraordinarily ill-advised. Even 50 years before the Social War, during the time of the historian Polybius, it was already a truism that Roman marching camps were immune to assault. Now granted, they were immune to assault from foreigners, and both the Samnites and Romans would know these camps equally well since they had been utilizing them for years, but still, what this proved was that the camp design, even when you know it, is still very difficult to penetrate and very easy to defend. And so Lucius's men will hold the camp steadily and repulse the Samnites with 6,000 casualties. We don't know how many men Lucius lost, but presumably not that many. So this was a fairly substantial victory. It's not decisive by any means, and it doesn't relieve either siege, but it now gives Lucius the initiative. We don't know what all he did during this campaign, but we know that one of his major decisions was to go all in on trying to relieve Acerrae. And so, to get there undetected or speedily before his enemy can recover, Lucius will elect to utilize the Melfa Gorge. He knew, given the history of the Samnites, that they would ambush him at some point. But he also, perhaps, was eager for a second fight so soon after his one big victory. And perhaps he thought this was the surest way to get that battle, and he might be able to beat a demoralized Samnite army at its own game and really win something there. However, this proved to be a miscalculation, as the ambush involved more men than he expected them to muster, and he ended up losing 8,000 men. Probably about 6,000 more on top of the 2,000 he already lost. So, he's lost at least 8,000 men, perhaps 10,000 total if we add in the earlier battle, out of 30,000 initial infantry, so he's lost a third of his strength. That's not great. That being said, this is not the worst of the campaigns the Romans mounted this year. He can't, therefore, relieve Osiri because he can't break through by force. However, he is close enough to the city that they can see his army, and they know Rome hasn't forgotten about them. And so that will inspire them to hold out longer. And so, his consulship will now come to an end, or at least he will have to go back to Rome because his colleague Lupus got killed. He has to hold elections, and he will also have to do some legislative duty. But for now, this is the sum total of his military record as consul, and if we're being generous, we could call it checkered. It's not exactly the best, even though obviously it's also not a complete catastrophe. It's far from what he wanted. In early 90, when Lucius Caesar and his fellow commanders had marched out to crush the revolt, the public mood in Rome was one of piss and vinegar. The Romans wanted to punish anyone who had had the temerity to suggest that they actually grant the demands of their allies. They also were firmly convinced that they would crush their allies by military force because their Roman virtue was superior to that of their allies. Never mind that they were culturally very similar and militarily had been fighting identically for a couple centuries. And predictably, they were not able to win any real victories in the course of the war's first year. Lucius had a victory, his cousin Sextus had a victory, and there wasn't all that much else to write home about. Marius had a couple minor wins, but nothing that actually changed the strategic calculus. And so, now that he had gone home, he found a Senate that was somewhat chastened. It appears that Lucius and his brother Caesar Strabo also had come to the conclusion that this war needed to be won not so much on the battlefield, but with a piece of legislation and some diplomacy. And so Lucius, as consul, will sponsor and pass a major bill called the Lex Julia de Civitate. And what this will do is grant full Roman citizenship to any communities of Latin and Italians who had had the good sense not to revolt. So any cities that had stayed loyal were now citizens. And so this sent a message that if you're loyal to Rome, you will eventually be rewarded. The other purpose of this is that after a year of fighting as they had, they knew that if this rebellion spread even further, if they lost more allies, then they would be truly screwed. So they're still not willing to admit that they were wrong exactly, but at the same time, they are starting to imply it. Then the following year, the Romans decide that even with the gains they make in 89, that the war's dragging on too long, it's leaving them vulnerable, and they pass a second bill whereby any rebels still in the field can lay down their arms and receive citizenship and a pardon, except for the Samnites and Lucanians, who are just too far beyond the pale. Although, interestingly enough, I do believe Mutilus himself will actually receive a pardon. I might be mistaken about that, but a couple of the leaders who plotted this and led armies actually do get pardoned. And one of them actually will live all the way until 80 when he finally falls prey to the Sullan proscription program. But for the most part, the Romans, again, even a year after this, are not fully willing to admit that they were wrong. Instead, they are merely trying to show how generous they are, because they don't want to have to kill all these people. They just want to be generous and good friends to their allies. Of course, right? It was the allies who were unreasonable for asking for citizenship, but if they have to have it, they'll get it, I guess. Technically speaking, to qualify for a triumph, all a Roman commander had to do was to fight a battle wherein he slayed 5,000 or more foreign opponents. That's why if you beat a slave army, you were not allowed to celebrate a triumph because slaves are not considered foreign, at least not in the full sense of being honorable opponents. One would expect that a similar kind of limit would be placed on fighting one's allies. If not because they shouldn't count as foreign, then because it would be impolitic to alienate them and declare them to be foreign enemies in that way. But in the case of Lucius Julius Caesar, he was the beneficiary of a public mood which needed some bolstering. They needed something to celebrate, and so because of that, and also because of Rome's long history fighting Samnites, he was given a triumph. And technically he did earn it. He defeated 6,000 Samnites in a battle. And if you ignore the rest of his campaign, that sounds impressive. So I have to imagine that two factors played into making this less embarrassing than it might sound. One is that Rome did have a very long history of fighting the Samnites, even if that history was gathering a lot of dust by this point. The other factor to keep in mind is that the Romans as a whole all admired the ability of Gaius Papias Mutilus. He was known as someone who was talented and a real threat. He was not a lightweight. And in fact, even after Sulla took command, and Sulla is almost always considered to be the best general the Romans had during the Social War, Mutilus might lose another battle or two, but nothing major, and his army will still be intact when he agrees to accept surrender. So apparently he was also able to negotiate out of the legislation that the Romans had passed, whereby the Samnites would not be treated equally. Or he just surrendered without getting citizenship. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but he does survive the war. This also shows that Lucius was a part of a dominant faction, because again, his credentials for a triumph, while he technically meets them, are not that strong. And so this means that not only does the public want something to celebrate, but also that Lucius must be pretty well connected for one of his enemies to not be able to shoot him down and point out the flaws in his campaign. So he was the beneficiary of circumstances, but also was clearly set up. Another factor to keep in mind is that he had just recently lost a powerful ally, which should be damaging in the long run, but in the short run, Sextus Caesar had also earned a triumph, because he had done enough in one of his battles to earn at least an ovation, probably a triumph, but he had then died of a camp illness before he had had a chance to celebrate it. And so perhaps this was also a way to commemorate his achievement, and maybe also to give a nod to Lucius Caesar's distant in-law, Marius, who had, as legate, won a few battles himself, a few small battles. So this could have been kind of a group celebration where Lucius was just the front man. At any rate, as terms of how triumphs are usually celebrated and what one has to do to win them, this is one of the weaker and more technical triumphs of all time. This is one that would not exactly inspire the future dictator Gaius Julius Caesar to look at as a model to emulate. He would definitely want his victories to be a lot more clear-cut and devastating. Although Lucius Julius Caesar's military track record was not the best, he had had a very successful consulship overall. He had earned a triumph, however weak a triumph it might be, and he had also passed a key piece of legislation that would help to bring the war to an end. The next year, he was actually elected censor alongside of his old friend, the greatly admired Senator Publius Licinius Crassus, the father of the future triumvir Marcus Licinius Crassus. Both of them would work on the citizenship issue, although Crassus would work on the more traditional concerns of a censor. So Crassus would look at things like banning foreign wines and unguents, so perfumes, basically. Whereas Lucius would devote himself entirely to enforcing his law from the year before. His original scheme was to place all the new citizens in newly created tribes who would vote last. Up to this point, the way that it worked is that Rome had 35 voting tribes, and the rich people are all organized into the tribes that voted first. And usually 18 of the 35 tribes would be composed of people who were wealthy or sub-wealthy. And then the next 17 tribes were much larger, and they're composed of poor people. So normally what happened is if there was a class issue, it would be decided early by a simple majority of the wealthy. And once those 18 tribes had voted, if they all voted together, then the tribes after them don't even get the vote because a majority's already been achieved. So the idea here is that now you would also have to achieve a majority, but out of the new number of tribes. So the older Romans would get a little bit more class representation at the expense of these new Romans getting a vote at all. So only in cases where an issue was truly deeply divided would the new citizens really have an impact. Now, obviously, that kind of defeated the purpose of what the Italians wanted. And so when a new bill was passed to offer amnesty and citizenship to people who were still under revolt, that was altered to now integrate Italians and Latins into the existing tribes based on their class status. So Lucius first started implementing the one system, And then as new legislation was passed, he had to undo all of that and then start doing the new work. The other factor to keep in mind is that a lot of men were not able to come to Rome during this time because they were away in the field, and that meant that trying to keep track of all the new citizens and make sure they're registered properly would have been a major pain in the ass, and undoubtedly was something he was not able to finish before he left office. Nonetheless, unlike many censorships, we know exactly what he was up to, how he was doing it, and we know that this work was extraordinarily important and controversial at the time. In 88, and probably even back in 89 when the elections for 88 were being held, Lucius Julius Caesar and his brother Gaius Julius Caesar Strabo became engaged in a rivalry with their old ally Gaius Marius. Marius was making a spectacle of himself, trying to show that he was still fit despite his old age, and campaigning for consul yet again. He'd already been consul 6 times, and that was an extraordinary number. Caesar Strabo actually tried to put himself up as a candidate against Marius, but was dismissed for being too young and not having held the praetorship first. Then, despite the fact that Sulla became consul and was assigned to fight Mithridates in the east, Marius and Sulpicius had gone before the people and gotten the command reassigned. Sulla decided not to take that in stride and instead march on Rome to reclaim his authority. And when he did that, Lucius and his brother actually actively cheered Sulla on. They gave speeches in the Senate praising his conduct and saying that he was the rightful commander and he was restoring law and order. And when he killed Sulpicius Rufus, they also cheered that as well. Unfortunately for the two brothers, events would now take a turn that was beyond their control. Marius would end up coming back in 87. He had gone into hiding, he had a tumultuous escape, he reemerged from Africa, and then he joined forces with Cinna, who was the leading politician opposed to the Caesar brothers and the various supporters of Sulla at the time. Marius and Cinna combined forces, marched on Rome, and started to round up their chief opponents. This was not a major bloodletting, but there were 6 senators who died when Marius retook power. And of those 6, 2 of them were men named Julius Caesar. Lucius and his brother Gaius Caesar Strabo. Lucius appears to have pissed Marius off enough so that he was beheaded and his head was displayed in the forum, along with those of his half-brother Lucius Catulus, and also of another close family friend, his old colleague Censor, actually. But the special malice was reserved for his younger brother, Caesar Strabo, because Marius made sure that Caesar Strabo's body was diced up like a sacrifice and then offered to the shade of a minor political opponent who apparently had committed suicide or died of despair after Caesar Strabo destroyed his career in a court case. But we'll tell that story in full when we talk about Caesar Strabo, who will be the subject of the next video. Lucius Julius Caesar was gone, but his legacy would live on, and the man himself was far from forgotten. His son and namesake, Lucius Julius Caesar, would go on to be consul in 64, and it was actually he and not his cousin Gaius Julius Caesar who would be the first Caesar to return to public office after Sulla's dictatorship. Also, despite the fact that Lucius Sr. had embraced Sulla at the end, his son would very much not embrace Sulla's legacy, but rather end up being the best friend and chief supporter of his more famous cousin, the younger Gaius Julius Caesar. And actually, yes, Lucius, the consul of 64, as I discussed in my video on him, was perhaps the most important ally Caesar had throughout his career. He was an ally and staunch supporter from the earliest moment of Caesar's career until the very end, and he actually will live beyond the Ides of March. So the only limitations on the younger Lucius Julius Caesar's help for his cousin is that he was not the most charismatic guy in the world, but also by the time that Caesar was nearing the end of his dictatorship, Lucius the Younger was a little too old to do certain things. As for Lucius's offspring, that these being the offspring of our Lucius still, his daughter Julia, so the sister of the consul of 64, went on to marry a man named Marcus Antonius Creticus, another person I've talked about in the past. He earned the name Creticus ironically because he went to Crete and got trounced by the locals when he was consul. However, the union itself was a success, and Creticus and Julia had 3 sons: Marcus, better known as Mark Antony to us, Gaius, who I've discussed before, and Lucius Antonius, someone I've also discussed before. So that means that, ironically enough, Lucius Julius Caesar, the guy we just talked about, is ultimately the reason why Caesar, the dictator, had such a great relationship with Mark Antony. And this is how they're related. So there you go. This is why Antony and Caesar were always related, and also why arguably Lucius's son and namesake was the glue guy in that relationship too. Another thing to keep in mind is that Lucius Julius Caesar, because of all of the illustrious offices he held, including a censorship, in theory should have given more prestige to his son Lucius than Gaius, the former praetor, could have given his son. Because again, the only Caesar in Rome who had an ancestor who was a censor was the Consul of 64, not the more famous Consul Gaius Julius Caesar in 59. Yet, due to personality, it would be Gaius Julius Caesar who would become the famous Caesar. By right, however, Lucius was older and had a slightly more illustrious pedigree. But personality plays a big role. And that's also not to mention that there was the whole Marius thing, because Marius was an uncle to Julius Caesar. In law, at least, but still an uncle, whereas he was more of a cousin-in-law to Lucius. And again, another thing to keep in mind, we talked about the Julian cohort at the outset. Despite the fact that there may have been some falling out between them for a moment in 88 and 87, once Lucius and his brother Caesar Strabo were gone, that tension seems to have died down, and once again, the sons of Lucius, Sextus, and Gaius Caesar were all close friends throughout their lives afterwards. So all of the cousins remained close in the next generation. In my opinion, the Julian cohort is massively underdiscussed whenever people are investigating the life of Caesar, the famous dictator. Their impact on him is pretty important. Not to mention their impact in general on the politics of their day. As I mentioned, in 91 and 90, the Caesars were very much the family in Rome. So for a minute, they had already prefigured the success that their famous descendant would have. The 9 or 10-year-old boy who was watching all this unfold at the time. Lucius, technically speaking, is the most accomplished of the 4 men. Now, he's probably not the most capable of the 4. That's probably his younger brother, who we have yet to talk about. Nor was he the best general of the 4. That was probably his cousin Sextus. But he technically does achieve the most because he has a triumph under his belt, even if it's not the most impressive in the world, and he also was a censor. As I mentioned also, his censorship is one of the ones that's the easiest to understand, because we know exactly what the business of the day was and where he stood on that business. It's also interesting when we look at the dynamic between Lucius, his brother, and his cousins, because Lucius and his brother were not shy about getting their hands dirty and being front and center. They sought the limelight. They sought out conflict and benefited from it, until, of course, it backfired in a horrific manner with Marius and Sulla. Whereas Sextus and Gaius were far more cautious. That would all be reversed later on with the younger Lucius and the younger Gaius, because the younger Lucius would actually avoid controversy for the most part. He was fairly prim and proper, not the kind of guy to sully himself by slinging mud, whereas the famous Caesar, while he tried to avoid things that were embarrassing, was not afraid to really get down and dirty and fight guys like Cato. And also get involved in controversies like his entire consulship, where he hired a gang to keep his colleagues stuck at home. So it is an interesting family dynamic how the relationship in terms of who was the upright, by the book Caesar and who was the dynamic, charismatic, rule-breaking Caesar, how that flipped in the next generation. And that also means, of course, that in many ways the dictator famously modeled his politics a little more on his cousins than he did on his father or uncle. Ultimately, the reason why we don't know more about Lucius Julius Caesar is because control of the family's memory in the end fell to Augustus. And remember, Augustus, while he had some kinship with Lucius as well, had less kinship with him than Mark Antony did. And obviously, Augustus and Mark Antony had a little bit of beef. Not only was Augustus forced to fight as a young man against Antony's younger brother Lucius, but he then fought a civil war against Antony that culminated at Actium. And so, he had some reasons for wanting to diminish Antony, and if downplaying the importance of Lucius Julius Caesar and his younger brother served that interest at all, well, that was a small price to pay for Augustus. This is also why I believe that Gaius Julius Caesar the Elder, despite being the least accomplished of the four, is the one who gets mentioned the most. And also, it fits Augustus's narrative of his stepfather emerging from the ether to restore the Julian line, if he mentions that his immediate forebear was a mere praetor rather than a consul, ignoring the fact that other members of the family named Julius Caesar became consul, and a young Caesar at, say, 8, 9, 10 years old actually saw that happen with his own eyes. But anyway, those are the thoughts I have for you on Lucius Julius Caesar. Next time, we'll be discussing his younger brother, Gaius Julius Caesar Strabo. So stay tuned for that. Until then, I'm Thersites the Historian. Like, comment, subscribe, and all of that fun stuff.